Welcome to the Tao at Night. Tonight, we are sitting with one of the oldest and most surprising teachings Lao Tzu ever offered, that nothing in the world is as soft as water, and nothing in the world is better at overcoming the hard and the strong. We know this to be true of rivers and stone. We have seen photographs of canyons carved by water over millions of years, walls of rock hundreds of meters deep, shaped entirely by something you can hold in your palm. And yet in our own lives, most of us still reach for hardness when we want to be effective. We make ourselves rigid when we are afraid. We push harder when resistance appears. We call this strength and wonder why we are so tired. Lao Tzu would have recognized this. He wrote about it with great gentleness, as though he understood how counterintuitive his teaching was, how difficult it would be to trust that softness is not weakness, that yielding is not surrender, that the open hand receives more than the closed fist ever could. Tonight we will follow this teaching through 13 chapters, moving slowly through stories of potters and poets, of divers and driftwood, of healers and people who found in the gentlest of actions what force had failed to accomplish for years. We will visit traditions from around the world, each carrying its own version of the same deep recognition that the soft, over time, overcomes the hard. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. These teachings are for anyone who has ever exhausted themselves pressing against something that would not yield, and wondered whether there might be another way to move through the world. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to accomplish tonight. There is nowhere else to be. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. Lao Tzu asked a question that sounds simple and is not. What is softer than water? Nothing, he answered himself. There is nothing in the world softer than water. Nothing more yielding, more formless, more willing to take the shape of whatever contains it. Water has no agenda of its own. It does not insist on a particular direction. It simply responds to what is there, filling the low places, following the contours of the ground. And yet Lao Tzu wrote, there is nothing in the world more effective at overcoming the hard and the strong. Not eventually, not in theory, in practice, visibly, repeatedly, everywhere you look. The Grand Canyon, the limestone cave, the roots of the willow that have found their way through the cracked foundation. Water, over time, is the dominant force in the physical world. This is not a paradox to be resolved. It is a teaching to be sat with. The soft overcomes the hard, not by meeting it with equal force, but by finding the places where the hard cannot follow. The crack, the hollow, the patient accumulation of small actions repeated over time. Lao Tzu was describing something he had observed everywhere, including in the human heart, the gentle word that reaches where the argument cannot, the quiet presence that dissolves what confrontation would only harden, the tears that release what effort cannot. Softness is not absence of strength. It is strength applied with perfect precision, exactly where it is needed, in the form that the situation can actually receive. There was once a young man who could not reach his father. They had been estranged for many years. The cause of the estrangement was not dramatic, a disagreement that had calcified over time into a silence, and then the silence had become so habitual that neither knew how to break it. The young man had tried. He had written letters that demanded acknowledgement. He had visited and spoken directly, naming the years of absence and asking for explanation. He had argued and appealed, and once shouted across the table of a meal that had been intended as a reconciliation. Nothing had worked. The father listened or did not listen, and the silence continued, or worse, a harder silence replaced the softer one. A Sufi elder in the young man's city heard this story one afternoon. "What do you want from him?" the elder asked. "I want him to hear me," the young man said. "You have tried loud speech," the elder said. "Has it worked?" "No." "Then you are still trying to open a door with a tool that does not fit its lock," the elder said. "The lock is not broken. Your tool is wrong." "What tool would work?" the young man asked. The elder was quiet for a moment. "Water," she said. The young man waited. "Not literally," she said. "A letter, one letter, a short one, not asking for anything, not explaining anything, simply one thing you are grateful for, one memory that is good, no demand at the end, nothing to be replied to, just the one thing and then silence." The young man did not believe this would work, but he had run out of arguments and he wrote the letter. One paragraph, a memory of fishing together when he was very young, the cold morning, the silence between them that had once been comfortable, a particular large fish that they had both laughed at and let go. He sent it and waited. 3 weeks passed. No reply. He decided, as he had expected, that nothing had changed. Then a letter came. 2 sentences. His father had remembered the same morning. He had also remembered a detail the young man had not included: the red boat. He mentioned that the red boat was still in the shed. The young man sat with this letter for a long time. 2 sentences. But 2 sentences that had not existed for 12 years. He wrote again, another small letter, another single memory, this time from later in his childhood, a winter morning, bread, something his father had said that had stayed with him. This went on for a year. Small letters, no demands. He never asked for anything. He only offered. At the end of the year, his father called. They spoke for 2 hours, not about the estrangement, about the red boat which was leaking, about the house which needed work, about small and ordinary things, and underneath the small, ordinary things, something that was not yet named but was no longer absent. The young man returned to the elder. "It worked," he said, slowly, "but it worked." "Water does not work quickly," the elder said. "It works completely. There is a difference." "He never addressed the years," the young man said. "I thought that would be necessary." "Perhaps it will be later," the elder said. "Or perhaps the years will dissolve on their own, the way sediment dissolves. You did not need to argue about the stone. You simply kept moving past it." The young man thought about this. He had spent 12 years trying to force an opening. 1 year of small, soft letters had done more than all of it. "Why does softness work?" he asked. "Because hardness meets hardness," the elder said simply, "and the meeting produces more hardness. Your arguments made your father more certain of his position, not less. Your small letters gave him nothing to be certain against. They only asked him to remember that he once knew you." The young man sat with this for a while. "What if the letters had never been answered?" he asked. "Then you would have written them anyway," the elder said. "Not for his sake only. The letters changed you as well as him. You spent a year looking for good memories rather than grievances. You spent a year practicing the skill of offering without demanding. These things do not leave you when the correspondence ends." She looked at him. "The softness you cultivated toward your father became part of how you move through the world. Whether or not he had answered a single word, that would have been worth the year." The young man understood, or began to. It would take him many more years to fully understand, in his body rather than his mind, what the elder had pointed at that afternoon. In Sufi poetry, the teaching of the soft word that reaches further than the hard one runs like a thread through the tradition's most celebrated verse. Rumi, the great Persian poet of the 13th century, returned to this image again and again. The reed flute that makes music precisely because it is hollow, because it has yielded to the emptiness inside it. The flute does not resist the breath, it receives it, and in receiving it becomes the instrument of something larger than itself. Rumi also wrote about the transformative power of gentle, persistent presence, what he called the company of the beloved. This is not a romantic metaphor only. It is a description of what happens when genuine care, repeated over time, softens what has hardened. The beloved's presence does not demand that the heart change. It simply remains gently, and in remaining gently, creates the conditions under which change becomes possible. There is also in the Sufi tradition the concept of lataif, the subtle centers or the subtle qualities of the heart. The Sufi masters taught that the heart is not opened by force. It is opened by refinement, by practices so gentle that the practitioner barely notices them, and yet over time these practices wear away the crust of habit and fear that has formed over the heart's original softness. The reed flute, the gentle letter, the year of small gifts without demands. In the Sufi reading, all of these are the same gesture. They trust that what is soft, offered consistently over time, will find its way through what is hard. Lao Tzu would have recognized this immediately. Think about a person in your life whose gentleness has stayed with you. Not someone who was forceful or impressive, someone whose softness left a mark. A parent who never raised their voice and was therefore more heard than any loud one. A friend who listened without agenda and in listening helped you hear yourself. A mentor who asked quiet questions rather than offering strong answers, and whose questions opened doors that direct advice would have kept shut. We remember these people with a particular quality of warmth, something more intimate than admiration. The gentle ones leave a different trace. Think also about a time when you yourself were gentle at a moment when force would have been easier, when you chose the small letter over the argument, the patient silence over the demand, The one true thing said softly over the many true things said loudly. This shows up in ordinary life in all the relationships where we have learned, slowly, through the failure of harder approaches, that being right is not the same as being heard, and that being heard is not accomplished by speaking more loudly. You may have felt this yourself in the particular quality of relief that comes after yielding in a long standoff, not the relief of losing, but the relief of discovering that what you were defending so hard was never quite worth the energy you gave to its defense. Right now, in this breath, you are being held by something softer than your own will. The weight of the blanket, the dark, the breath itself, which asks nothing and gives everything. There is no hardness required here. The night receives you exactly as water receives, without argument, without condition, taking whatever shape you bring. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu observed that water does not act alone. It acts in accumulation. 1 drop does not carve stone, 100 drops do not carve stone. But 1 drop falling on the same point of stone, repeated 10,000 times a day for 1,000 years, produces something remarkable. This is a teaching about the power of consistency, not dramatic, single actions, small actions, softly applied, over and over in the same direction. This is how rivers find the sea. This is how roots find water. This is how a young tree, bent gently in one direction year after year, grows curved in a way that no amount of force applied after the fact could have accomplished. There is something in this teaching that runs directly against the way most of us have been taught to think about effectiveness. We are drawn to the decisive action, the breakthrough, the moment of sudden change. We undervalue the small, repeated gesture. We undervalue patience. We undervalue the cumulative power of soft things applied consistently. Lao Tzu understood this so deeply that he made it one of the central images of the Tao Jing. Not water as a metaphor for spiritual feeling, but water as a demonstration of a principle that operates in material reality. The same principle that works in stone works in human relationships, in learning, in healing, in any endeavor where what is needed is not a single application of force, but the slow, patient accumulation of something soft. Consistency, applied gently over time, is the most powerful force available to us. There was once a young man who wanted to make rope. He had seen rope made before, but only the finished kind, thick and strong and reliable. He did not know how it was made. He assumed that strong rope required strong material. When he tried to make his own, he went looking for the thickest, sturdiest fibers he could find, the coarsest grasses, the thickest plant stems, anything that seemed to have force already in it. He brought these to an old rope maker and presented them proudly. "These are strong," he said. "I thought, for rope that holds weight, you would want the strongest material." The old woman looked at his materials. She picked up one of the thick stems and tried to bend it. It bent, then snapped at the bend point. "Strong alone," she said, "is brittle alone." She set his materials aside and picked up a different bundle from her workbench. Thin, almost thread-like strands of a particular plant, so delicate that they moved in the air currents when she held them up. "Feel this," she said, and handed him a strand. It was almost nothing. He could break it between 2 fingers. "This?" he said. "Twist 2 of them together," she said. He did. He was surprised by the slight increase in resistance. Now 10. He twisted 10 of the thin strands together. The resulting cord was still thin, but already it required something from his hands to break. Now 100. This was harder to manage. She helped him twist a length of 100 strands together. The cord that resulted was perhaps half the thickness of his thickest single fiber. "Try to break it," she said. He tried. It did not break. He looked at it. "How?" he asked. "Each strand finds the spaces between the others," she said. "The twisting creates tension that distributes across all of them. No single strand carries the load. All of them carry a share, and together they carry more than any one of them could carry alone, and more than a single thick fiber that holds everything in one place and therefore fails in one place. So many soft things together are stronger than one hard thing," he said. "More than that," the old woman said. "The flexibility is part of the strength. Rope that cannot bend is rope that breaks under load. The twist allows each strand to give slightly while the others hold. When the rope is pulled, the strands tighten against each other rather than breaking apart." He picked up the cord and pulled it. He could feel exactly what she described, the slight give, the gathering tension, the way the pull distributed rather than concentrated. "What happens when one strand breaks?" he asked. "Nothing changes," she said. "Not noticeably. One strand among 100 is one strand. The rope holds. When 10 strands break, the rope holds still. When 50 break, you begin to worry. But a rope made of thick, hard fibers breaks at the first significant flaw, and the flaw in a hard material goes through it like a crack goes through brittle glass." The young man thought about the ropes he had trusted his weight to in the past, the ones that had held and the ones that had frayed. He had never known what he was looking at. "Can I learn to make rope this way?" he asked. "That is why you came," the old woman said. "He spent several months learning. The hardest part was the habit of looking for the strongest seeming material. He kept reaching for the thick stems, the rigid fibers. The old woman kept redirecting him to the delicate ones. "Your hand wants the hard," she said once. "Your hand is wrong." Over time, his hand learned. He learned to feel what made a good strand, not its thickness, but its length, its consistency, its capacity to twist without breaking. He learned that the best rope came from material that seemed, in isolation, almost too delicate to be useful. He also learned something that surprised him. The process of testing the rope told him as much as the process of making it. Every rope he made, he tested differently, pulling it, suspending weight from it, twisting it deliberately to stress the individual strands, leaving it out in rain and sun and cold, and pulling it again. He was not trying to break the rope. He was trying to understand where it would break and why, and what the failure would teach him about the making. The failures, he found, were always instructive. The rope that broke at a particular stress told him something about the fiber he had used, the angle of the twist, the tension he had maintained. Each failure was information. Each repaired failure produced a slightly better rope. It was the same lesson the rope had been teaching him. Many soft things, wound together in the right way, bear more than anyone expects. In Lakota tradition, the understanding of communal strength, many soft things together, is woven into the very structure of how the community understood itself. The Lakota word mitakuye o yasin, often translated as all my relations or we are all connected, is not simply a spiritual statement. It is a description of a worldview in which individual strength is understood as insufficient, and communal weaving, the intertwining of many lives, many efforts, many gifts, is the source of genuine resilience. A single hide does not shelter a family through winter. Many hides, prepared and sewn together by many hands, do. A single person's knowledge of the land cannot ensure a community's survival. The woven together knowledge of many people, accumulated over many generations and shared freely, provides something that no individual could carry alone. The Lakota also understood this principle in terms of how strength is maintained over time. A community that concentrates strength in one person or one point becomes vulnerable at that point, like the thick fiber that breaks at its single flaw. A community that distributes strength across many people, each contributing something soft but real, creates resilience that no single crisis can sever. This understanding of strength as distributed softness, rather than concentrated hardness, also runs through Lakota teachings about leadership. The greatest leaders were not the most forceful. They were the ones who listened most carefully and spoke most seldom, gathering the strands of many voices and finding where they could twist together into something that held. Lao Tzu wrote that the highest good is like water. The Lakota understood that the highest community is like rope, many strands softly wound, bearing more than any of them could alone. Think about the small, repeated actions that have produced the most significant results in your own life. Not the dramatic interventions, the habits. The morning practice that felt trivial on any given morning, but accumulated over years into something substantial. The daily attention to a relationship that seemed like maintenance, but turned out to be the relationship's entire foundation. The consistent small kindness that eventually changed how someone saw you, and perhaps how you saw yourself. These things are easy to undervalue because no single instance of them feels significant. The one drop does not carve stone, but you were not making one drop. You were making a river, and you did not see the canyon forming because you were only ever close enough to see today's drop. This shows up in ordinary life in the frustration that comes from doing the right thing without visible results. The exercise that seems pointless for weeks before anything changes in the body. The skill practice that feels like marking time before the plateau breaks. We live close to our own actions and often cannot see what they are building. You may have felt this yourself in the particular surprise of realizing at some later point that something had changed, that a quality you had been practicing had somehow become part of how you actually are, not just how you were trying to be. Right now, in this moment, your body is doing many small things together. The heart is beating, one beat at a time, each beat something less than a gram of force, and yet over a lifetime those small soft beats will do more work than any strong thing you could name. The breath is breathing, many soft actions, without drama, without force, producing something extraordinary. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote that the hard and the strong are companions of death, the soft and the yielding are companions of life. This is startling language. He was not speaking poetically. He was pointing at something he had observed directly, that rigidity in nature and in human beings precedes breaking. The dry branch snaps, the green one bends, the inflexible mind, encountering a reality that does not match its expectations, is more likely to shatter psychologically, spiritually, than the mind that can yield to what is actually there. The Stoic philosophers arrived at a closely related understanding, though they came from a different direction. They observed that the wise person is not the one who has eliminated all disturbance from their inner life, but the one who has developed the capacity to bend toward disturbance without being broken by it. Not rigidity which breaks, not dissolution which loses form entirely, but resilience. The green branch quality, the capacity to return to upright after being bent low. What makes something resilient? Not hardness, not the refusal to bend, the capacity to bend fully and return. And this capacity depends precisely on a kind of inner softness, the willingness to be moved, to feel the weight, to experience the bending, and to trust that the return is possible. In human terms, this is the capacity for grief, for uncertainty, for the experience of being genuinely affected by what happens. The person who has hardened against all of this is not strong. They are brittle. And brittle things, when the right stress arrives, break completely. There was once a student who asked a Stoic teacher which of two things was stronger, iron or water. In what circumstance? The teacher asked. The student was annoyed. In general, he said. There is no in general, the teacher said. But let me show you something. He took the student to a spring that fed a small stream. The stream ran through a garden, and the garden had been tended for many generations. The teacher pointed to a stone step that crossed the stream. This step has been here for 60 years, the teacher said. Feel the center of it. The student crouched and ran his hand across the stone. The center of the step, where the water ran over it in wet weather, was visibly lower than the edges, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The stone had been worn by 60 years of water. And here, the teacher said, pointing to the edge of the stream bed. The student looked. Along the edge where the water met the iron-rich clay, there was rust in the soil, reddish deposits where water had worked on metal over the years. Water wins against both, the student said. Eventually, the teacher said, Not quickly, not in any single encounter, but water has one advantage that neither iron nor stone possesses. Water has no investment in being hard. Iron must be iron, stone must be stone. Water is whatever the container allows it to be, and so it is never broken by being something else. The student thought about this. But iron has uses that water doesn't, he said. Of course, the teacher agreed. I am not saying water is better than iron. I am saying that iron's very hardness, the thing that makes it useful, is also the thing that makes it vulnerable. Iron is powerful in the ways iron is powerful. It fails in the ways iron fails. It has no adaptability. And the Stoic teaching, the student asked, are we to be water? We are to understand which quality is needed when, the teacher said, the wise person has the capacity for iron, for firmness, for holding position, for the refusal to be moved when movement would be wrong. And the wise person has the capacity for water, for adaptation, for receiving, for the yielding that is not surrender, but responsiveness. He paused. The problem is that most people only practice one. They practice hardness and believe this is strength, or they practice yielding and believe this is virtue. The mark of real understanding is knowing which moment calls for which quality. How do you tell? The student asked. The teacher looked at the stream for a while. The stream does not decide, he said finally. It responds. It is hard when it meets hard. You have seen how water moves around an obstacle rather than through it, with tremendous force at the narrowing. It is soft when softness serves, spreading over flat ground, taking the offered shape. The deciding is not a thought, it is a sensitivity. He turned to the student. This is what we are developing in practice, not rules for when to be hard and when to be soft, the sensitivity to feel what the moment requires. The student went home and thought about this for a long time. He thought about all the situations in his life where he had brought iron to a moment that needed water, and all the moments where he had spread himself too thin when what was needed was concentration and firmness. He could not always tell, even in retrospect, which was which, but he began to feel something he had not felt before. A question arising in difficult moments, a pause before the automatic response. What does this actually need? Iron or water? The pause was small, but the pause was new. Stoic philosophy developed an idea that sits at the heart of this teaching, amor fati, love of fate, the complete acceptance and even embrace of what is. This is not passive resignation. The Stoics were not passive. Marcus Aurelius fought wars, governed an empire, managed crises, all while holding this attitude toward events. Amor fati is the understanding that reality will not be different from what it is, and that energy spent resisting what is cannot simultaneously be spent responding to it. This is the Stoic version of water's teaching. Water does not argue with the landscape, it accepts the landscape completely. Every contour, every obstacle, every available hollow, and then flows through it with perfect responsiveness. This is not because water lacks force. Water, as we have seen, is enormously powerful, but its power is deployed in alignment with what is actually there, not in conflict with it. The Stoics also developed a distinction between things within our control and things outside it. Everything within our control, our judgments, our values, our responses, is where strength properly belongs. Everything outside it, other people's behavior, external events, the shape of the landscape, is where yielding is not just wise, but the only intelligent response. When you push against what is outside your control, you exhaust yourself without changing anything. When you yield to it, accept it fully, the way water accepts the shape of the riverbank, you preserve your strength for the response that is actually available. Lao Tzu arrived at the same teaching from a different beginning, but the recognition is identical. The soft does not fight reality, and because it does not fight reality, it moves through reality more efficiently than anything hard could. Think about the situations in your life where you have been iron when water was needed. Perhaps a conversation where you held your position so firmly that the conversation broke rather than resolved. Perhaps a project where your certainty about the correct approach prevented you from seeing the better one that was available beside it. Perhaps something in yourself, a belief, an identity, a way of understanding who you are, that you have defended so thoroughly against challenge that it has never been tested, and therefore never deepened. These are not failures of character. They are responses to fear. Hardness is almost always a response to fear, the fear of being changed, moved, affected, found inadequate. And there is nothing shameful in that fear, but there is a cost to it. The cost is the loss of the water quality, the adaptability, the responsiveness, the capacity to take the shape that this moment actually requires rather than the shape you decided on in advance. This shows up in ordinary life in the difference between the person who is confident and the person who is certain. Confidence can be questioned, can integrate new information, can be wrong and survive. Certainty cannot. Certainty is iron. Confidence is something closer to water. It knows where it is going, and it will find the way there, but it does not insist on a specific route. You may have felt this yourself in the particular exhaustion of defending something you stopped believing in years ago, the position so thoroughly held that you no longer remember whether you chose it or whether it chose you. Right now, in this breath, nothing is required of you. No position to defend, no certainty to maintain. The night asks only for the one thing water never withholds, the willingness to settle into the shape that is offered. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu used the image of water yielding to describe something paradoxical. It is the very absence of rigidity that gives water its power. Water has no shape of its own. This is not a limitation. It is the source of its extraordinary adaptability. Because it has no shape to protect, it can become any shape that is required. We tend to think of having a strong identity, a fixed nature, a definite character as advantages, and in some circumstances they are. But Lao Tzu was pointing at the shadow side of fixity. The thing that has a fixed shape can only fit in spaces that match that shape. The thing without a fixed shape fits everywhere. This applies to how we hold our beliefs, our opinions, our ways of understanding the world. A mind that is fixed in its understanding can only receive what confirms that understanding. A mind that has something of water's quality, shaped by what it encounters, rather than imposing its shape on what it encounters, can receive genuinely new information, can be changed by experience, can learn in the deepest sense. This is not the same as having no opinions or no values. Water still flows downhill. It still has a direction. But within that direction, it is completely available to the contours of the path. The values point the direction. The water quality moves through the terrain. Lao Tzu called the person who has cultivated this quality the sage, not someone who has no self, someone whose self is fluid enough to move with the Tao without friction. There was once a glassblower who shaped glass through breath. He had been working for many years. He had trained under a master who had trained under her master, and the tradition went back many generations. He knew the work well, the gather of molten glass on the end of the blowpipe, the shaping through breath and rotation, and the careful use of tools, the gradual emergence of form from something that had, a moment before, been shapeless. A young student came to learn. The student had read about glass-blowing before coming. She had studied the physics of it, the way glass behaves at different temperatures, the relationship between viscosity and workability. She arrived knowing quite a lot, in theory. The first morning, the master handed her the pipe with a gather of glass on its end. "Blow," he said. She blew hard. The glass swelled rapidly and then collapsed, thin and bubbled at one side. She tried again. This time she held back. The glass barely moved. "You are fighting it," the master said. "I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong," she admitted. "Both times wrong," he said. He took the pipe back and gathered fresh glass. He held it up so she could see. Glass at this temperature does not want to be glass yet. It wants to be something between glass and air. If you blow hard, you are making it be glass too quickly. If you hold back, you are letting it cool into glass before you have shaped it. The breath has to meet the glass where the glass actually is. "And where is it?" she asked. "You have to feel it," he said. "Not through the pipe. The pipe is too long for that. Through the heat, through the speed of the turning. There is a moment when the glass is ready to move. Your breath at that moment does very little. The glass does most of the work." She watched him demonstrate. His breath was barely visible, a slow, consistent exhalation that seemed almost too gentle to do anything. But the glass swelled evenly, moved exactly where he guided it, took on the shape he had barely suggested. "You are not making the shape," she said slowly. "You are providing the conditions for the shape to appear." "Yes," he said. He seemed surprised she had found these words so quickly. "Yes, that is exactly it." She practiced. It took many weeks before she could feel what he was describing, the moment when the glass was ready, the quality of breath that met it without overcoming it or being too timid. There was a particular quality to a good gather that she came to recognize, a slight drag in the turning, a particular luminosity, something that was not visible in any way she could name, but that her hands began to register as information. When she finally found it, really found it, so that her breath and the glass moved together without conflict, she understood something that she could not have understood from the physics. The glass was not passive. The glass was participating. She was not imposing a shape. She and the glass were negotiating a shape, and the best shapes came from the negotiation rather than from her determination. She said this to the master one afternoon. "Yes," he said again, "the glass knows what it can become at this temperature. Your breath knows what it can suggest. Between these two knowings, the form arrives. If either of you insists too much, the negotiation fails." She thought about other negotiations she had been in, human ones where she had insisted too much and the form had failed. "This is a teaching about more than itself," the master said, and returned to his work. In Hindu philosophy, the concept of prakriti, nature or material reality, holds a teaching about form and formlessness that resonates directly with the glass and the breath. Hindu cosmology describes creation as a process not of imposition, but of unfolding, the universe taking forms that were already implicit in the underlying nature of things. The great variety of forms we see in the world, every animal, every mineral, every human being, is not the result of something being forced into a shape from outside. It is the result of the underlying energy taking the shape that belongs to it in this particular combination of conditions. The concept of Maya, often translated as illusion, is sometimes misunderstood as the claim that the material world is not real. But a more precise reading is that the particular forms of the material world are not permanent. They are like the gather of glass on the pipe, real, useful, beautiful, while they are what they are, and then return into a less differentiated state when their time is complete. The Hindu tradition also carries the teaching of sahaja, the natural, effortless, innate quality of things. The path of sahaja is not the path of effortful striving toward an ideal, but the path of allowing what is naturally present to come to its full expression. This is the breath's relationship to the glass, not imposing a shape, but allowing the shape already implicit in the glass's own nature to emerge. Lao Tzu described the sage as one who accomplishes without forcing. The Hindu tradition describes this as working in alignment with the deep nature of things, prakriti, cooperating with the human hand rather than being overcome by it. Think about the moments in your life when you were most fully yourself. Not the moments of greatest performance necessarily, the moments of greatest ease, when you were doing what you did and it felt natural, unforced, as though the action were arising from somewhere deeper than decision. These are the moments when you were glass and breath together, rather than one imposing on the other. When your particular nature was meeting a situation that offered exactly the right conditions, when the form that was always implicit in you was finding its expression without obstruction. These moments are not accidents, though they often feel like them. They arise from the combination of preparation, the long practice of the glass blower's art, and the willingness, in the specific moment, to yield to what the material is actually doing. The preparation alone does not produce them. The yielding alone does not produce them. Both together, at the right moment, produce the thing that neither could produce separately. This shows up in ordinary life in the particular texture of creative flow, the writing that writes itself, the conversation that arrives somewhere unexpected and wonderful, the problem that suddenly becomes clear not because you worked harder at it, but because you stopped working at it in the wrong way. The glass taught you. You listened. You may have felt this yourself in the difference between the hours when work is labor and the hours when work is something closer to play, lighter, faster, more alive, arriving at better results with less exhaustion. Right now, in this moment, something in you knows what form it wants to take in sleep. You do not need to impose sleep. The conditions are here. Your breath is the gentlest possible suggestion. The glass knows what it can become. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. One of Lao Tzu's most direct statements on softness and strength comes near the end of the Tao Jing. The soft overcomes the hard. He was not speaking of spiritual matters only. He had watched water long enough to know that this was simply a description of what happens given time. But there is a subtle additional teaching embedded in this statement. Lao Tzu did not say, the soft eventually overcomes the hard. He did not say, the soft defeats the hard by superior force. He said the soft overcomes, which implies a particular kind of action, a kind of surrounding and permeating and finding the way through that is different from direct opposition. Water does not oppose stone. Water finds the places where stone is absent, the cracks, the pores, the angles, and enters those places. Over time, the water in the cracks expands and contracts with temperature changes, widening the cracks. More water enters, the process continues. What we see in the result is that the stone has yielded, but at no point did the water attack the stone. The water simply went where the stone was not, and the stone gradually became less than it had been. This is a teaching about the strategy of softness. It is not passivity, it is precision. The soft thing succeeds not by being strong, but by being specific, by finding exactly the places where its particular quality can act, and acting there consistently over time. This requires patience and the willingness to not insist on a frontal approach. The Tao does not overcome the hard by being harder. It finds the crack. There was once a diver who learned to go deep. She lived on a coast where pearl oysters grew in the beds beyond the reef, in water too deep for the casual swimmer, but reachable, barely, for someone who had cultivated the particular art of breath-holding and descent. She had been diving for several years and had reached a plateau. She could go to a certain depth. Below that depth, her body would tighten. Her breath would shorten, and the effort required became more than the remaining breath could support. She came up always feeling as though she had fought her way back. An old diver in the village had a reputation for going deeper than anyone else. This old woman was not physically powerful. She was slight and unhurried in all her movements. The young diver went to her with a direct question. "How do you go so deep?" she asked. "I don't go deep," the old woman said. "I fall." The young diver waited for more. When you push yourself down, the old woman said, you use the air in your lungs to push against. The more you push, the more quickly the air is consumed in the effort. By the time you arrive at depth, you have already spent much of what you came with. But how do you go down without pushing? The young diver asked. Have you ever watched a stone fall into water? The old woman asked. Yes. Does the stone push? No, it just... She paused. Falls. Yes, the old woman said. At a certain depth, the weight of the water above you is greater than the air in your body, and you become naturally heavy. Above that depth, the air makes you float. At that depth, you tip into heaviness, and the water takes you down. Your job is not to fight your way there. Your job is to relax enough that the water can do its work. The young diver tried to understand this. But my body wants to fight, she said. Your body wants to survive, the old woman said. That is correct and necessary. But survival does not always require fighting. Sometimes it requires the opposite. Have you ever been caught in a wave? Yes. And what happened when you fought it? I was tumbled. I didn't know which way was up. And when you stopped fighting? The young diver remembered. She had been tumbled by a large wave once, years ago, and in the tumbling she had stopped fighting. She could not remember why, perhaps from exhaustion, and the moment she stopped, she felt the buoyancy of the water itself carry her toward the surface. The water helped me, she said slowly. The water was always helping you, the old woman said. You were fighting the help. The young diver tried the new method on her next descent. She slipped under the surface, and rather than pulling herself down, she exhaled slightly, releasing the extra buoyancy, and simply waited. The water took her, slowly at first, then faster. The sensation was entirely different from anything she had experienced in years of diving, not the effort of fighting her way down, but something more like trust, like the stone falling, like being received rather than fighting to enter. She reached a depth she had never reached before. She could feel it in the pressure, in the quality of the light filtering from above, in the particular cold of the water at that depth. She had perhaps 15 seconds before she needed to begin her ascent. She looked at the pearl beds around her. They were extraordinary at this depth, richer, more varied than anything she had seen in the shallower water. She came up slowly, the way the old woman had also taught her, not racing for the surface, but trusting the buoyancy to bring her, spending no more energy than was necessary. At the surface, she breathed. She found the old diver sitting on the rocks. You went deeper, the old woman said. It was not a question. Yes. How? I fell, the young diver said. The old woman smiled. The young diver sat down beside her. After a moment she said, It felt like trust. Yes, the old woman said. I had to trust that the water would take me, and that it would give me back. She paused. Which is not obvious from inside. No, the old woman agreed. The water has taken people and not given them back. That is true. And so the trust is real trust, not the trust that says nothing bad will ever happen, but the trust that says, I understand the nature of this element well enough to move within it. I know how to be in this depth and how to return from it. That knowledge allows the trust. The trust allows the falling. She looked at the water. People confuse trust with certainty. Trust is what you have when you understand something well enough to commit to it without certainty. Certainty is what you want before you have the knowledge. They arrive in the wrong order. The young diver went back to the depths many times after that. Each dive a small lesson in trust. Buddhist teaching holds a concept that illuminates this learning directly. Upekkha, equanimity, the quality of being completely present to what is happening without being thrown by it, without adding the extra tension of resistance. The monk who goes to the meditation hall trying to achieve peace will often find that the trying prevents the peace. The practice tightens around its own goal. The teacher instructs the student to sit, to breathe, to notice, not to achieve, and in the not achieving, something that was always present becomes accessible. This is exactly the young diver's discovery. She did not achieve depth. She allowed depth. She stopped adding her own tension to a situation that was already capable of taking her where she needed to go. The Buddhist tradition also teaches beginner's mind, the openness of not knowing, the receptivity of someone who has not yet decided what the experience is going to be. The expert, paradoxically, can struggle with this. The expert has done this many times and knows what to expect. The expectation, held firmly, can interfere with the actual experience of what is happening in this moment. The young diver's years of diving had produced both skill and a set of expectations about what diving was. Effort, struggle, the fight to reach depth. Her beginner's mind, in the moment she stopped fighting, allowed her to discover that diving could be something entirely different. Lao Tzu would have recognized this as the soft overcoming the hard, not through superior force, but through the discovery that the force was never necessary, that the way was always available to those who stopped insisting on a harder one. Think about a situation in your own life where relaxing produced what effort had not. Perhaps learning a physical skill, swimming or driving or playing a musical instrument, where the moment you stopped trying so hard, the skill became available. Perhaps a creative project, where the breakthrough arrived not when you were pressing hardest, but in the hours after you had given up for the day. Perhaps sleep itself, the nights when you tried hardest to sleep being the nights when sleep was most elusive, and the nights when you let yourself simply lie there without agenda, being the nights when sleep arrived most quietly. This is Water's teaching made personal. Not the instruction to stop trying entirely, the instruction to stop adding your own hardness to a situation that is already trying to take you where you need to go. This shows up in ordinary life in the particular physics of trust. When you trust the water, when you trust the process, the person, the situation, you stop spending energy on the resistance that your mistrust generates. And without that resistance, you move faster, not slower. You arrive at depth with more left in you than the fighter who battled every meter. You may have felt this yourself in the specific quality of working with someone you deeply trust, the ease, the speed, the quality of what emerges, compared to the effortful grinding of work done with someone you are simultaneously managing and defending against. Right now, in this moment, the depth is available. You do not need to fight your way there. The water below you is already taking you. Exhale slightly. Release the buoyancy. Fall. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a quality of water that Lao Tzu described using a single Chinese character that scholars have translated in many ways, as contentment, as sufficiency, as knowing when enough is enough. Water fills a vessel until it is full, and then it stops, or rather, it overflows. It does not push beyond what the space can hold, but finds the next lower place and flows there. It is never grasping. It does not insist on accumulating beyond what the present moment requires. This is a teaching about the kind of softness that comes from genuine sufficiency. The person who is never enough, who must always have more, recognition, achievement, resources, certainty, is a person who is always hard, always pressing, always in the mode of acquisition. And the pressing hardness of that mode produces exactly what Lao described as the companion of death: rigidity, brittleness, the inability to stop and simply be in the fullness of what is actually present. The soft person, in the Taoist sense, is not passive or unambitious. They are someone who can recognize sufficiency, who can feel the moment when the vessel is full and turn their attention to the overflow rather than to forcing more in. In practical terms, this is the capacity to rest, to stop when the day's work is done and actually be done, rather than continuing the work in the mind all through the evening and the night. It is the capacity to say, "This is enough for today," and to mean it. There was once a leather worker who spent her days making things that would last. She had learned her craft from her mother, who had learned it from hers. The tools were old, and the methods were old, and the materials, though they came from the same sources they always had, were understood through a knowledge that had been accumulating for generations. The most important tool in her workshop, she always said, was not a tool at all. It was a basin. The basin was ordinary, wooden, wide, shallow. It held water. Before any piece of leather was worked, it was soaked in the basin, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a day. Sometimes, for the most difficult and resistant pieces, for 3 days. A young apprentice who came to learn asked about the basin on her first morning. "We don't start immediately?" she asked, looking at the hides laid out on the table, ready and waiting. "Not until the leather is ready," the leather worker said. "How long does it take to be ready?" the apprentice asked. "Different for each piece," the leather worker said. "Come, feel this." She picked up a corner of a hide that had been soaking since the previous day and handed it to the apprentice. Then she picked up another hide, dry, and handed her that. "What's the difference?" she asked. The apprentice moved both pieces in her hands. The dry one was stiff, resistant, held its shape against any pressure. The soaked one was something else entirely. It moved with her hands, yielded to her fingers, became different with each gentle manipulation. "The wet one feels alive," the apprentice said, surprised. "Yes," the leather worker said. "The dry one feels like what it is, dead material, cured and hardened. The wet one has been softened back toward something. Not toward life exactly, but toward workability. Toward the state where my tools and my hands can have a conversation with it. And if you work the dry one? The apprentice asked. The dry one cracks, the leatherworker said. The tools cannot reach it. You work the surface and nothing changes underneath. And the worked surface becomes brittle faster than material that has been worked correctly. She set both pieces down. Water is the most important step in making something that will last. The hurried worker skips it. Their goods look fine initially. After 2 years they are cracking. The apprentice watched the soaking basin with different eyes after that. She saw it not as waiting, but as preparation. The most important preparation, the one that everything else depended on. "What else does the water do?" she asked one afternoon, after several weeks. The leatherworker thought about this. "It opens the material," she said. "Leather is made of fibers like rope. Those fibers, when dry, lock against each other. The water releases the lock. The fibers become able to move slightly against each other again, to accept shaping. After the shaping, when the leather dries, the fibers lock again, but in the new shape. The memory of the water allows the memory of the shape." The apprentice considered this. "So the water doesn't change the leather permanently," she said. "It just makes a window, a moment when it can be changed." "Yes," the leatherworker said, "and you have to use that window well. Too much time and the leather becomes too soft. It loses its structure. Too little time and it is still fighting you. There is a window where the material is ready, and the skill of the craft is partly knowing when that window is open." The apprentice asked how long she had been reading those windows. "My whole life," the leatherworker said, "and I still sometimes misjudge. I begin work too soon, and I can feel the resistance, and I have to choose whether to push through it, which costs the material, or to return the piece to the basin and wait." She picked up a half-finished piece and held it. "The honest answer is that the window I am looking for is not a fixed amount of time. It is a quality, and the quality takes years to learn to feel." She set the piece down. "The new workers always want a rule. 3 hours for thin leather, 8 hours for thick leather, and those are starting points. But the rule is only the beginning. The real teaching is in your hands, and your hands only learn it by touching thousands of pieces in thousands of states." The apprentice learned to read the windows. She learned to put her hands on the soaking leather and feel the change, the transition from resistance to receptivity. It took her 2 years to feel it consistently. She understood by the end of those 2 years that this was the craft's deepest teaching, not the cutting or the stitching or the finishing, though these were all part of it. The deepest teaching was patience, the willingness to wait for the window rather than forcing the work on material that was not yet ready to receive it. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a concept called hitlahavut, burning or enthusiasm, the flame of genuine engagement, and alongside it, a teaching about when hitlahavut is appropriate and when it leads astray. The great Hasidic masters understood that enthusiasm could become its own form of hardness. The practitioner who throws themselves at their practice with maximum force and maximum intensity sometimes achieves less than the one who approaches with quiet consistency. The flame that burns brightest also burns out soonest. The candle that burns low and steady lights the room all night. This is the Hasidic version of the leatherworker's basin. The correct preparation, the soaking, the softening, the patient creation of the conditions in which the real work can occur is not wasted time. It is the work itself, recognized as such. The Hasidic teaching of avodah, service or worship, specifically includes the understanding that service is not always effortful activity. Sometimes service is the willingness to wait in the right state of receptivity for the moment when genuine action is possible. The farmer waits for the right season. The leather waits in the basin. The prayer waits in the stillness of the heart before it rises into words. There is also in Hasidic teaching the concept of bittul, self-nullification, the softening of the ego's insistence on its own agenda. This is not self-erasure. It is the same quality the leather develops in the basin, the capacity to receive shaping, to be worked with, to hold the memory of what has been offered, rather than remaining in the hard, locked state that cannot receive anything. Lao Tzu described the sage as empty, like a vessel. The Hasidic tradition described the servant of God as soft enough to receive what God offers. Different words for the same quality of readiness. Think about something in your life that required more preparation than you gave it. Not something you failed, something where the result was adequate but less than it might have been because you moved before the conditions were ready. A conversation you entered before you had sat with the question long enough. A project you launched before the thinking was fully developed. A relationship you pressed forward before the trust had built sufficiently to hold what you were putting into it. We are trained, in most contexts, to move quickly. Preparation is seen as delay. The basin is the step we skip when we are in a hurry, but the leather's memory of the water is what makes it hold the shape it was given. And the person who is not softened, who arrives at the conversation or the work or the relationship still in their dry, locked state, cannot receive the shaping that the moment is offering. They move through the experience without being changed by it, the way the tool moves across dry leather and changes nothing underneath. This shows up in ordinary life in the difference between a rest that actually restores and one that merely passes time. The person who spends an evening sitting in front of a screen while their mind continues to process the day's difficulties has not softened. Their fibers are still locked. The person who has genuinely rested, who has let the day go, who has let themselves be empty for a while, wakes different. You may have felt this yourself in the particular quality of sleep that follows a genuinely quiet evening. Not the sleep that comes from exhaustion, but the sleep that comes from having actually stopped. The leather that has been in the basin long enough, right now, in this moment, the basin is here. You are soaking. Let the fibers unlock. Let the day's shape slowly release. The new shape will come in the morning. Tonight, just the water. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote about the valley as one of his central images of the soft and the yielding. The valley does not resist the water, it receives it. And because it receives, it is always full. The rivers run to it, the rain collects in it, life gathers around it. The mountain rising above everything has grandeur, but the valley has water. This teaching is about the power of the low place, of the receptive, humble, receiving position, not because lowness is a virtue in itself, but because lowness is where things gather. Water does not flow uphill. Water flows to the lowest available point, and there it collects, and from its collecting, it nourishes everything around it. Lao Tzu applied this to the quality of spirit he was describing. The sage does not insist on height, does not demand that everything flow upward to them. The sage accepts the low position, the position of the listener, the learner, the one who does not know, and in accepting it becomes the place where wisdom naturally collects. Others come with what they know, and in the presence of the genuine listener, they discover more of it. This is the valley quality applied to human interaction. The art of receiving so completely that the giver is transformed by the giving. Not everyone can do this. It requires a genuine emptiness, not a performed humility, but an actual interest in what is being offered, an actual willingness to receive something that might change your understanding. This is harder than argument, harder than teaching, harder than speaking. It requires, in a way, everything. There was once a woman who was known for the quality of her silence. She had not sought this reputation. She was simply a person who, in conversation, had learned over many years to listen before speaking, and then to speak only when she had something that had not already been said by the people around her. This made her unusual. In most conversations, she was the quietest person in the room. But people noticed that conversations in her presence tended to go somewhere. They arrived at conclusions that they had not been approaching when they began. They opened questions that had been closed. They ended with something that had not been in the room at the start. A young man who had been studying philosophy came to spend time with her, curious about the method. "I have been told you know something about how conversations work," he said. "I don't know anything about that," she said. "I just listen." "But listening is a skill," he said. "It might be," she said. "What do you mean by listening?" He thought about it. "Taking in what the other person is saying," he said, "not interrupting. Following the argument." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you do those things?" she asked. "I try to," he said. "And yet," she said, "you came here to tell me about conversation rather than to ask about it." He stopped. "I didn't realize I was doing that," he said. "Most people don't," she said. "We think we are asking when we are telling. We think we are listening when we are preparing our reply. The listening I do, whatever you want to call it, begins earlier than that. It begins before I know what I think about what is being said." He was interested now. "What does that mean?" "Before you know what you think. When you say something to me," she said, "I notice that something forms in me, a response, a judgment, a place where I agree or disagree. This is very quick. It happens before I have really heard you, and if I speak from that quick forming, I'm speaking to my impression of you, not to you." And if you wait, then the quick forming is allowed to pass. Something slower and more accurate forms underneath it. And when I speak from that, if I speak at all, I am actually speaking to what was said. He sat with this for a while. The quick response is like the surface of the water, he said finally. The slower thing is the depth. Yes, she said, something like that. And depth requires what? Just waiting? Waiting and genuinely not knowing, she said. Waiting with the answer already formed is just the slow delivery of the quick response. The waiting that produces depth is the waiting in which you genuinely don't know yet, in which you are open to being surprised by what you hear. He asked her how she had learned this. By failing, she said, many times. By speaking from the quick forming and watching the damage it did, to conversations, to relationships, to my understanding of things, by noticing that the damage came from a particular quality of certainty I had brought before the conversation was complete. She paused. And slowly the noticing produced a change. I became more interested in the damage than in the certainty. And eventually the certainty became less important than the actual thing that was being said. The young man went home and tried to listen differently. It was harder than he had expected. The quick forming was very quick and very confident, and sitting past it required something he could only describe as patience with his own mind. He noticed something he had not expected. The quick forming was not always wrong. Sometimes what formed immediately was accurate, and the waiting only confirmed it. But waiting confirmed it in a different way, with a quality of certainty that had been tested rather than merely assumed. Even when the rapid assessment and the slower one agreed, the slower one felt different, more arrived at, more his. He also noticed that the discipline changed the quality of his relationships in ways he had not anticipated. People who had previously found him quick and argumentative began to say something different about him. Not that he had become slower, he was not slower, but something in the quality of his attention had shifted, and other people could feel it without being able to name it. He was actually present with them, rather than present to the version of them his mind had already constructed. But occasionally he managed it fully. And when he did, when he arrived at the slower, more accurate understanding, the conversation produced something that his quick responses never had. In Japanese Zen, the capacity for this quality of listening is understood as one of the marks of genuine practice. The Zen concept of mushin, no mind or empty mind, is often misunderstood as a blank or passive state. But mushin, in its full meaning, is precisely the opposite of blankness. It is a state of complete responsiveness, so open to what is actually present that nothing is missed, nothing is filtered by preference or expectation. The expert swordsman, the master calligrapher, the deeply experienced practitioner in any domain achieves mushin, not by shutting off their awareness, but by purifying it, removing the interference of predetermined response. This is the valley quality. The valley does not decide in advance what kind of water it will receive. It receives whatever comes and holds it and nourishes life with it. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki wrote that in beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. This is the Zen version of the young philosopher's lesson. Expertise, when it closes into certainty, loses the receptivity that made it valuable. The senior student who knows the answers is often less capable of learning than the beginner who knows the questions. The highest listening is the listening of the valley, receiving everything, holding it without judgment, allowing whatever is genuinely nourishing to settle and collect. Lao Tzu described the sage as knowing without traveling. This is only possible if the sage has cultivated the quality of receiving, if the sage has become the valley into which knowledge flows from every direction, rather than the mountain that must climb toward each piece of it. Think about the last time someone truly listened to you. Not waited for you to finish, not prepared their response while you spoke. Actually listened, so completely that you found yourself saying things you had not known you were going to say, arriving at understandings you did not have before the conversation began. This is rare, which is why it is so memorable when it happens. The person who can listen like this is not particularly mysterious. They have simply cultivated the valley quality, the willingness to receive without immediate counter-pressure, to let what is offered settle before responding. And the effect of being truly listened to is itself remarkable. You hear yourself more clearly. You say more accurately what you mean rather than what defends you. You arrive somewhere rather than simply circling the position you came in with. This shows up in ordinary life in the difference between conversations that exhaust and conversations that restore. The exhausting ones are the ones where each person is primarily pressing against the other. The restoring ones are the ones where each person is primarily receiving the other, and in the receiving creating space for something to emerge that neither brought. You may have felt this yourself in a particular conversation with a particular person, the one who seemed to understand you before you had finished explaining yourself, not because they had information you lacked, but because they were listening at a depth you rarely encountered. Right now, in this moment, the night is the valley. Everything you bring to it is received without argument. The thoughts that are still moving, the concerns that haven't fully settled, the night holds all of it without judgment. And gradually, in the holding, things quiet. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Taoism describes the sage as one who does not contend. This is not cowardice. Lao Tzu was describing something more subtle. The recognition that contention, in most circumstances, is not the most effective form of action available. When two hard things meet, the encounter produces friction, heat, resistance, sometimes damage. The harder thing wins, for now, but the winner is also changed by the encounter, depleted, marked, and the cycle of contention produces more contention. The defeated thing, if it survives, comes back harder and more determined. Contention generates more contention. Water does not contend. Water flows around. Water finds the space between the stones and enters it, and in entering it becomes distributed through the entire structure in ways that no direct frontal attack ever could. The river does not break the bank, it goes around the bank and around and around, and slowly the bank becomes the river's bed. This is not avoidance. It is a different kind of engagement with the space that exists rather than the resistance that exists. The resistance is real. The space beside the resistance is also real, and often more productive. In human terms, this shows up in all the situations where softening an approach, not weakening it, but changing its form, produces results that direct confrontation cannot. The gentle question that reaches where the demand cannot. The patient presence that changes what an argument could only harden. The willingness to take the longer route that eventually arrives rather than the short route that keeps being blocked. There was once a healer who worked with hands. She had spent many years learning her art under teachers who had varying approaches. Some teachers pressed firmly, deep, assertive work that addressed the problem directly and resolved it quickly sometimes. Other teachers moved more lightly, with a quality of touch so supple that it was hard to say what exactly they were doing. She had been practicing for 10 years when she encountered a particular difficulty she had not met before. A man came to her with a pain that had persisted despite treatment by several other healers, including some who were far more experienced than she was. The pain was in his shoulder, specific and localized, and it had been there for 3 years. He could not lift his arm above a certain height. He had been treated with strong techniques, with direct pressure, with methods that should, by most assessments, have addressed the problem. Nothing had worked. If anything, some of the treatments had left him more guarded. His whole shoulder complex had learned to brace against the expected pressure. She placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. She did not do anything. She simply waited. After a while, she moved her hand to a slightly different position, still very lightly, still not doing what most people would call treatment. After an hour, longer than any of her sessions usually ran, she stopped. "That's all?" he asked. "For today," she said. He came back 3 days later. The pain was slightly different. Not less exactly, but its character had changed. It was in a slightly different location. "Good," she said. "How is that good?" he asked. He was frustrated. "Something moved," she said. "The pain that stays in exactly the same place year after year is the pain of something that has locked. The pain that moves is the pain of something that is beginning to unlock. I am not treating the pain. I am treating the holding around it." He agreed to continue. Over 6 weeks, the same light, indirect approach, working not at the site of the problem, but at what the body had built around the problem to protect it. At the end of 6 weeks, he had most of the movement back. Not all, but most. "Why didn't the direct approach work?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered how to explain it. "The direct approach," she said, "told your body that something threatening was happening. Your body, which had already been protecting that area for 3 years, responded the way it always responds to perceived threat. It braced harder. The treatment was fighting the protection, not the problem." She paused. "My approach was not addressing the protection directly. I was working at the edges of the protection, very softly, giving your body nothing to brace against. Without anything to brace against, the protection slowly relaxed. And when the protection relaxed, the problem that had been underneath it became accessible. Water finding the cracks, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Exactly that. She had not used that image herself before. She had found her approach through trial and error and the teachings of her teachers, not through philosophy. But she recognized the truth of it when she heard it. She had been working all this time with the principle of water without knowing that was what she was doing. She began to teach it explicitly after that, in those words. Many of her students found it the most useful thing she taught. Not a specific technique, but a way of understanding what technique was for. Not to overcome the body's defenses, but to create the conditions in which the body's defenses were no longer necessary. She also taught them the particular quality of patience that the indirect approach required. Her students, trained in assertive methods, found it difficult to work at the edges. Their hands kept wanting to move toward the site of the problem. She had a simple instruction for when this happened. When the hands want to move toward the problem, move them away from it. Work where you are not expected. Stay at the periphery longer than seems necessary. How do you know when you stayed at the periphery long enough? One student asked. The periphery stops being interesting, she said. When the body has accepted your presence there, it stops responding. When it stops responding at the periphery, something at the center will have shifted. Then and only then is the center approachable. This required the willingness to do work that produced no visible result for long periods, to stay at the edge of a problem doing apparently very little, while something underneath changed at its own pace. It was difficult. It was also, for those who could sustain it, the most effective approach available. Celtic healing traditions carry a similar understanding, that the healer's art is less about the removal of what is wrong and more about the restoration of what is natural. The ancient Celtic concept of healing, as it can be reconstructed from surviving texts and practices, is deeply connected to the idea of balance and the restoration of right relationship between the person and their own body, between the person and their community, between the human and the natural world. Illness, in this understanding, is not simply a malfunction to be corrected. It is a signal that something has gone out of right relationship, and the healer's task is to help restore the relationship rather than simply suppress the signal. This is a profoundly water-like understanding of healing. Water does not decide that the landscape is wrong and work to correct it. Water responds to the landscape as it is, flowing through it, revealing its contours, pooling where the ground allows pooling, rushing where the gradient calls for speed. The Celtic healer, in the traditional understanding, brings a similar quality of responsiveness, working with what the body is doing, not against it. Celtic tradition also contains the concept of the anamkara, the soul friend, or the companion whose relationship with you is so complete that they can see you more clearly than you can see yourself. The soul friend does not heal you. They hold the space in which your own healing becomes possible. This is the lightest possible touch, presence rather than intervention, and it is the one that, in the long run, does the most. Lao Tzu and the Celtic healers found the same truth from different starting points, that the body knows more than the healer about what it needs, and that the healer's art is the art of listening to what the body already knows. Think about a time when you were gentler with yourself than you expected to be, and found that the gentleness helped more than the force had. Perhaps an injury or an illness that you stopped fighting and found that the not fighting allowed the healing to proceed at its own pace, which turned out to be the right pace. Perhaps a difficulty in your inner life, a grief, a fear, an uncertainty that you stopped trying to resolve and found that simply acknowledging it, holding it lightly, produced a change that all the effort to fix it had not. We are taught to fight what is wrong in us as well as outside us, and sometimes fighting is right. But the healer's teaching suggests that much of what we call fighting ourselves is the body bracing against the treatment, the protection bracing against what it perceives as threat, and that the thing that actually needs to be addressed is underneath the protection, only reachable through approaches so gentle that the protection has nothing to brace against. This shows up in ordinary life, in the difference between how we respond to our own pain and how we would respond to a friend's. With a friend, we are gentle. We hold the space. We do not demand that they be well faster than they are ready to be. With ourselves, we often do the opposite, press harder, demand more, wonder why the direct approach is not working. You may have felt this yourself in the particular quality of care you received when you most needed it. Not the advice, not the fixing, but the presence. The hand on the shoulder, very light. Right now, in this moment, you can be your own healer. The most effective thing you can do for your body tonight is nothing that looks like effort. Light attention, soft breath, the gentlest possible hand. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu observed that the highest good is like water, and one of water's most important qualities, one he returned to more than once, is that water benefits 10,000 things without contending. The river does not decide which field deserves water and which does not. It flows according to the terrain, and everything in the terrain receives what the flow can reach. This absence of preference, this complete generosity within the limits of what is possible, is one of water's most striking qualities. Lao Tzu was describing a quality of spirit that is very different from what most cultures have called virtue. Virtue, in most traditions, involves choosing correctly between good and bad, generous and selfish. Lao Tzu was describing something that operates before choice, a natural generosity that flows without deciding to flow, the way water flows without deciding which field is most deserving. This is the quality of the person who has genuinely stopped keeping accounts, not the person who pretends not to keep accounts while secretly noting every gift and slight. The person who has actually stopped, who gives when giving is available and withholds when withholding is appropriate, without maintaining a ledger of what is owed. This quality is difficult to cultivate and easy to recognize when you encounter it. The person who has it has a particular quality of ease in their generosity. They do not look at you to see if you noticed. They do not position themselves as the giver. They simply flow, the way water flows, and you are nourished by it without quite knowing it has happened. There was once a grandmother who had grown very old. She was not a leader in any formal sense. She held no title. She had not traveled widely or accumulated notable achievements. She had raised children and tended a garden and cooked many meals and sat with many neighbors through many difficulties. But in her village, something happened in conversations when she was present. People spoke more carefully. They found the right word more often. Old grievances surfaced and resolved. Young people who had been certain of their positions sometimes left those conversations less certain, which they discovered later was a gift. A scholar studying community life came to observe her and spent several months in the village. He noticed first that she spoke very little. In gatherings where everyone else spoke several times, she might speak once briefly. In smaller conversations, she asked questions more often than she made statements. He noticed, second, that when she did speak, a particular quality of attention gathered. Not because her voice was loud or her manner commanding, something else. He went to her with his observations. People listen to you differently than they listen to each other, he said. I don't know about that, she said. I've watched for several months, he said. It's noticeable. When you speak, the room changes. When others speak, equally wise people, people with more information on many subjects, the room doesn't change in the same way. What do you think causes it? She asked. He was struck that she asked rather than explained. I think it's because you don't speak unless you mean it, he said. And people can feel that. Perhaps, she said, though I'm not sure I always mean what I say any more than anyone else. But you've sat with it longer, he said. Before you speak. She thought about this. I learned many years ago, she said, that most of what I wanted to say in a conversation was not about the conversation. It was about me, about being seen to understand, or being right, or being helpful. And I noticed that saying those things didn't help anyone very much. It just satisfied something in me. So you stopped? He asked. I started waiting to see if the thing I wanted to say was still there after those reasons passed, she said. Usually it wasn't. It dissolved when the reasons for saying it dissolved. She paused. Occasionally, something remained, something that didn't belong to me, and that was when I spoke. The scholar sat with this. You learned to filter out what was yours, he said. I learned to notice the difference, she said. The ones that are about being seen, about being right, they feel urgent. They press forward. They want to be said now before the moment passes. The other kind feels quieter, more patient. It can wait. It will still be true in an hour. And when you speak the patient ones, sometimes they help, she said. Not always. The patient ones can also be wrong, but they're wrong in different ways than the urgent ones. The urgent ones produce defensiveness. The patient ones, even when they're wrong, produce something else, less contention. The scholar returned to his work with something he had not had when he arrived, not a theory, an observation. The softest words, he wrote, were the ones that had been given time to separate from the speaker's need for them to be heard. Ubuntu philosophy, the Southern African tradition, carries a teaching about the quality of speech that resonates directly with this grandmother's understanding. In Ubuntu communities, the concept of Ubuntu itself, usually expressed as "I am because we are," implies a fundamental interconnectedness in which my speech is not only mine. When I speak in a gathering, I am adding something to a shared space. The question is not only what I believe, but what this contribution does to the quality of the shared space. This understanding produces a different ethic of speech than the one most Western traditions carry. The value of a contribution to conversation is not primarily its correctness or its wit or its information value. It is its effect on the relational fabric of the gathering. Does this word bring people together or create distance? Does it clarify or confuse? Does it honor the dignity of everyone present or diminish someone? Ubuntu traditions also carry the concept of isithunzi, a kind of dignity or presence that is cultivated over a lifetime and is recognized by the community. Elders who have isithunzi do not need to command attention. It gathers around them. This presence is the result of long practice in precisely what the grandmother was describing, the filtering of what is urgent and self-serving, so that only what is genuinely useful passes through. The grandmother's word that waited had isithunzi, not because she had performed patience or cultivated a reputation for wisdom, because what she said had genuinely been separated from her need to say it. Lao Tzu described this as water benefiting all things without contending. The word that comes from genuine sufficiency rather than need. Think about someone in your life whose words carry particular weight. Not necessarily the person who speaks most or most loudly or with greatest apparent confidence, the one whose rare word lands differently, feels true in a way that does not require argument, settles something that had been unsettled. These people are teachers without being teachers, authorities without credentials. They have learned through long practice and probably through many mistakes the particular quality of speech that comes from patience with their own need to be heard. This shows up in ordinary life in the very practical question of what to say in difficult conversations. The temptation is always to say more, to explain more fully, to make the case more completely, to leave no misunderstanding unaddressed. But the grandmother's teaching suggests something different, to wait until the words that are urgent have passed, and to speak, if at all, only from what remains. You may have felt this yourself in a particular conversation, where you said less than you had planned, perhaps out of restraint, perhaps out of the conversation moving in a direction you had not expected, and found afterward that what you had said had been exactly right, that the not saying had made room for something more true than what you would have said. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing that needs to be said. The mind may be forming sentences, habits of the day still working. Let them form and dissolve. The sentence that waits until this moment has nothing more to add will still be true in the morning. The urgent ones will probably dissolve. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu returned many times in the Taoism to the image of the valley and the sea. The sea is the lowest point of 100 rivers, and so it receives them all. It does not rise to meet the rivers. The rivers come to it because it is lower than they are, and water always flows to the lowest available point. This is a teaching about the power of the humble position, not the performance of humility, but the genuine acceptance of the lower place. Not because the lower place is inferior, but because the lower place is where everything collects. In Polynesian wayfinding tradition, there is an understanding of navigational skill that carries a similar quality. The master navigator does not stand at the prows scanning the horizon with great authority. They sit low in the hull, feeling the swell beneath them, responding to information that only comes to those who are in contact with the water, not above it. The information the swell carries, the direction of distant islands, the interference patterns that tell a skilled navigator where land lies beyond the horizon, this information is subtle and pervasive. It cannot be read from a position of height or authority. It can only be read by someone who has made themselves receptive to it, who has, in a sense, gone down to meet it. This is Lao Tzu's teaching made practical. The low place, the receptive position, the willingness to be below rather than above, this is not weakness. This is where the information is. And information, accurately read, is more powerful than any other resource. There was once a woman who learned to read the color of the sea. She had grown up near the water and had been on boats her whole life, but the deeper knowledge, the navigator's knowledge, the reading of the sea's character rather than its surface, had not been part of her upbringing. She learned it as an adult from a teacher who had spent 70 years on the water. The teacher was very old and did not speak much. She communicated largely through demonstration, taking the young woman out on the water and showing her things, waiting to see if she saw them. On their first day out, the teacher stopped the boat in a particular location and waited. "What do you see?" she asked. The young woman looked at the sea. She saw the surface, the small waves, the light on the water, the color, which was a particular deep blue. "Blue," she said. "What kind of blue?" the teacher asked. The young woman looked at the sea. She saw the surface, the small waves, the light on the water, the color, which was a particular deep blue. "Blue," she said. "What kind of blue?" the teacher asked. "Deep," the teacher said simply. "This water is deep below us. The color is darker because there is more water beneath us than there was an hour ago." She moved the boat slightly. "And here, the water was slightly different, a very subtle shift, lighter, with a faint greenish quality." "Shallow," the young woman guessed. "Shallowing," the teacher corrected. "We are moving over a rise. In another 100 meters, the color will be lighter still, and there will be sand visible through the water." The young woman looked at the water with new eyes. What she had been seeing as flat, uniform blueness was, when she attended carefully, a map. Not of the surface, but of what lay beneath it. Over the following months, The teacher showed her more of this language, the patterns that indicated currents running in certain directions, the particular quality of chop that told of shallows around a headland, the color that meant a freshwater spring was meeting the sea, the very subtle oil-calm quality of the water's surface in certain conditions that experienced navigators could read as a sign of sheltered depth. "How long did it take you to learn all this?" the young woman asked one afternoon. "I am still learning it," the teacher said. "At 70, I still see things I have not seen before. But the basic reading, the color, the chop, years," the teacher said. "Many years of being wrong and then understanding why I was wrong. The sea does not explain itself. You must build the understanding from the errors." "What's the hardest part to learn?" the young woman asked. The teacher thought about this. "To look without deciding what you see," she said. "To truly not know what the water is saying and wait until it becomes clear." She paused. "The most common mistake I see in students is that they learn the vocabulary. They know that dark blue means deep, light means shallow, and then they stop looking. They look for confirmation of what they already know rather than for what is actually there. And how do you avoid that? You have to maintain genuine curiosity," the teacher said. "Genuine uncertainty. The moment you think you know the sea will show you something you have never seen, and if you are certain, you will misread it. If you are curious, you will see it." The young woman thought about this for the rest of the season. She tried to maintain the uncertainty even as her vocabulary grew, to hold each new piece of knowledge lightly enough that what she was actually seeing could still surprise her. The teacher noticed and said nothing. But one afternoon, on a day when they had seen something unusual in the water, a pattern neither of them had encountered before, the teacher looked at her student's face and saw exactly the quality she had been trying to teach. Not anxiety, not false confidence, but genuine interest. The face of someone who did not know and was glad of it. "Yes," the teacher said, though nothing had been said to prompt the word. "Like that." Polynesian wayfinding traditions hold what may be the world's most sophisticated body of knowledge, built entirely on the reading of subtle signals, the kind of knowing that only comes from a position of deep receptivity. The great wayfinders of the Pacific could navigate thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, reading the stars, the swells, the birds, the clouds, the phosphorescence in the water at night. This knowledge was not the product of individual genius. It was accumulated across many generations, held in memory systems of extraordinary precision, and passed from teacher to student through direct transmission, which is to say, through exactly the kind of relationship the old teacher and the young woman had. What made this transmission possible was the particular quality of attention the tradition cultivated. The wayfinder did not impose their model of the ocean on the ocean. They read what the ocean was doing, and doing this well, doing it with the accuracy that allowed a canoe to arrive at a small island after 3 weeks at sea without any landmarks visible, required a quality of receptivity that was, in its own way, as demanding as any form of intellectual training. The Polynesian teaching is also clear about the relationship between knowledge and humility. The more you know, the more precisely you can perceive what you don't know. The beginner looks at the sea and sees blue water. The master looks at the sea and sees a text of extraordinary complexity and knows that they are still learning to read it. Lao Tzu wrote that knowing others is wisdom, but knowing yourself is enlightenment. The Wayfinder tradition adds, knowing the sea is knowledge, but knowing what the sea can still show you is wisdom. Think about a skill or domain where you have developed enough knowledge to know what you don't know. This is a particular and valuable kind of awareness. The awareness that comes not at the beginning of learning, when you don't know what you don't know, but somewhere in the middle, when the contours of the unknown become visible. You can see the edge of your knowledge from the inside. This is not a comfortable place. It is more comfortable in some ways to be the beginner who doesn't know the ocean is a text they can't yet read. But the discomfort of this middle place, the awareness of the gap between what you understand and what there is to understand, is the awareness that keeps you learning. It is the water quality applied to knowledge, the refusal to harden into certainty. This shows up in ordinary life in the difference between the expert who has stopped being curious and the expert who has become more curious. Both have knowledge. Only one has the teacher's quality, the openness that makes further transmission possible. You may have felt this yourself in the particular pleasure of meeting someone who knows a great deal and remains genuinely interested in what they don't know. These people are a pleasure to learn from, not because they give you the most information, but because they make curiosity feel safe. Right now, in this moment, your mind may still be carrying the day's conversations, the conclusions reached, the positions taken, the certainties assembled. Let them all be uncertain for a while. The sea at night does not need to be read, it simply moves. And you move with it, and in the morning there will be time enough for the reading again. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote about the power of not acting. Wu Wei, effortless action, in terms that can be misread as passivity, but are in fact a description of something very precise, acting only from the quality that the situation requires, adding nothing unnecessary. Nothing unnecessary. This is a demanding standard. Most of our action contains quite a lot that is unnecessary. The ego's need to be seen acting, the anxiety that multiplies the response beyond what the situation requires, the habit that substitutes for genuine attention, the performance of effort that mistakes busyness for effectiveness, the soft action strips all of this away. What remains is exact, small, often barely visible. Lao Tzu illustrated this with the image of rain. Rain falls on everything equally, without preference, without force. Each drop is almost nothing, but collectively, over time, rain feeds the crops, fills the rivers, shapes the landscape, sustains everything. The individual drop matters less than the quality of the distribution, consistent, gentle, without agenda, reaching everywhere. This is what the most enduring work looks like from close up, unremarkable in any single instance, meaningful only in the accumulation, and only fully visible from a distance. The great canyon seen from the air, the relationship that has survived many decades, the forest that has been growing since before any living person was born. All of them the product of small, soft actions, repeated without drama over enormous stretches of time. There was once a painter who worked with rain. Not literally, she worked with pigments and brushes on large pieces of bark, but the quality she sought in her work was the quality of rain. Consistent, patient, reaching every part of the surface without preference, without urgency. She had been painting for many years before she understood this. In the beginning, her work was energetic and uneven, some areas overwrought with detail, others barely touched. She could see the places in each piece where her attention had gathered and the places where it had moved on too quickly. The attention in her early work was distributed according to where she found things interesting, rather than according to what the piece needed. A very old painter visited the community and spent several weeks working nearby. She watched him paint each morning. His method seemed almost impossibly slow. He covered his bark in the thinnest, most even first layer she had ever seen, almost no pigment, barely a suggestion of color, just a consistent modification of the surface across every part of it. Then he let it dry, then another layer, equally thin and even, then another. After many days of this, a quality began to emerge in the piece that she had not seen in her own work. Not depth exactly, something more complex than depth. A luminosity. The light seemed to enter the surface and return from somewhere beneath it. She asked him about the method. "It is the same surface everywhere," he said. "The color emerges from many thin layers rather than from a few thick ones. Each layer is transparent. The eye looks through each one to the layer below. The luminosity comes from the accumulation." "But it takes so long," she said. "It does not take long," he said. "It takes the time it takes. Long and short are about your expectation, not about the work." She watched him more carefully after that. She noticed that his attention was in fact distributed exactly like rain. He did not work from an interesting part of the piece outward, the way she did. He worked across the whole surface in each session, moving without preference, covering everything with equal care before returning to any area a second time. "Why not work on what's most interesting first?" she asked. "Because what seems most interesting at the beginning is not always what the finished piece will rest on," he said. "The interesting part is often where my own preference is, where I want to put attention. The finished piece needs attention distributed according to what the piece needs, not what I find interesting." She tried this in her next work. It was difficult. Her attention kept moving towards certain areas, the parts that were developing well, the parts where the color was doing something unexpected. She had to consciously return to the less interesting areas, the corners, the edges, the passages that seemed to need nothing yet. She found over many months of this practice that the less interesting areas turned out to be crucial. They were the foundation. The interesting areas rested on them, and when the foundation was thin, the interesting areas eventually seemed unmoored, not connected to anything. The consistency mattered more than the attention. The rain mattered more than the storm. "When did you learn this?" she asked the old painter before he left. "When I stopped trying to make good work and started trying to make honest work," he said. Good work is about the interesting parts. Honest work is about all of it. Aboriginal Australian artistic and spiritual traditions contain an understanding of the relationship between attention and totality that speaks directly to what the old painter was teaching. In many Aboriginal traditions, the painting of country, the depiction of the land and its songlines, its sacred sites, its relationships, is understood not as the expression of individual artistic vision, but as an act of responsibility toward the whole. Every part of the country must be present in the painting. The uninteresting places, the less sacred sites, the ordinary topography, all of it is part of the whole. And a painting that omits it for the sake of the interesting parts is a painting that has failed in its fundamental purpose. This principle extends to the way country is cared for. The practice of caring for country, burning, tending, maintaining the relationships between plants and animals and water, requires consistent attention to the whole, not just to the spectacular parts. The ordinary creek matters. The ordinary grassland matters. The health of the whole depends on the health of every part, including the parts that seem unremarkable. There is also in Aboriginal tradition the concept of attention to country as a form of listening. The land speaks through what happens in it, and the person who pays consistent attention to the whole land hears what the person who only notices dramatic events cannot. Lao Tzu's image of rain feeding the whole world equally, without preference for the interesting parts, is the same teaching arriving from a different sky. The consistent, patient attention that reaches everywhere is more nourishing over time than the dramatic attention that burns bright and leaves some parts of the world perpetually in drought. Think about the parts of your life that receive your consistent, undramatic attention. Not the areas that are interesting or urgent or in need of management. The ones you show up for every day in small and ordinary ways, without drama. The relationships maintained by the regular text, the shared meal, the brief check-in that seems like nothing significant. The practice is sustained by showing up even when the motivation isn't particularly strong. The work that is unglamorous but forms the foundation everything else rests on. These are the rain areas of your life, and they are usually the most important ones, though they rarely get the attention that the storms get. This shows up in ordinary life in the retrospective recognition that the people and practices we maintained quietly, without fanfare, over long periods, were the ones that mattered most when something difficult happened. The friendship kept alive by consistent small contact was there. The practice sustained through ordinary days was available in the extraordinary ones. You may have felt this yourself in the particular quality of gratitude you feel towards something, a person, a place, a practice, that has simply been consistently present, not dramatic, not impressive. Just there every time you needed it to be there. Right now, in this moment, something has been consistent on your behalf all day. The body, the breath, which came again and again without being asked. The heart, which has beaten all day in the same patient rhythm. The rain falling on the whole surface, every part of it without preference. Not tonight's drama, tonight's ground. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu had a particular quality of attention for what is small. He praised the uncarved block, the raw material before it has been shaped into anything definite. He praised the infant, who is not yet hardened into fixed patterns. He praised the seed, which is nothing and is everything. This is a teaching about beginnings, about the potential that exists in what has not yet become anything. We tend to celebrate what things have become: the carved statue, the grown person, the mature tree. Lao Tzu was interested in what they were before they became those things: the block of jade before the chisel, the soil before the planting. Because the block of jade, before it has been carved, contains every possible jade carving. Once it has been carved into one thing, all the other possibilities are gone. The carving is a gain and a loss simultaneously. A specific form is gained and infinite potential is lost. This is not an argument against carving. Lao Tzu was not saying, do not make anything, do not become anything, preserve all possibilities forever. He was making a subtler point, that we should be aware of what we close when we commit to what we open. Every choice is also a letting go of other choices. This letting go, held consciously, keeps us honest about what we are choosing and why. Water in a seed is this teaching made biological, the vast potential of the full-grown tree held in something that could be mistaken for nothing at all. There was once a farmer who grew corn in a village surrounded by difficult land. Most years the harvest was adequate. Some years, when the rains came well and the season was favorable, the harvest was good. And in a few extraordinary years, once in a decade or so, the harvest was remarkable. The yield so abundant that the village had enough to trade and to store against the lean years. The farmer's neighbors asked her over many decades what she was doing differently in the good years. She had been farming the same land with the same methods for a very long time. Nothing different, she always said. And she meant it. She was doing nothing different. The land was doing something different, but what she meant by this took a long time to explain to anyone who asked. The good years, she had learned over decades of observation, always followed seasons that had produced something specific, a particular combination of winter cold, spring rain, and early summer warmth, in a sequence that she had come to recognize in the years before the good harvest arrived. She could not control any of these things, but she could read them. When she saw the sequence forming, she prepared differently. She chose which fields to plant more carefully. She selected seeds from her store that were suited to abundance rather than to survival. Seeds she kept separate precisely for these moments, having learned that the seeds best suited to survival were not the best suited to thriving. She waited, also, a few additional days before planting. This was the hardest part of her method. In the years she anticipated abundance, she planted later than her neighbors, when the soil had reached a temperature she could feel with her hand rather than measure by the calendar. "Doesn't that risk the early growth?" a young farmer asked her once. "Less risk than the opposite," she said. "Corn planted in cool soil survives. It is always a little stunted. It is always a little less than it might have been. The corn planted in warm soil doesn't survive. It thrives. She pressed her hand into the earth. The seed knows the difference. I am only asking it to wait until the conditions are right for thriving rather than surviving. How did you learn to feel the temperature? He asked. Years of paying attention, she said, and years of being wrong. I planted too early several times in my youth. The corn was adequate. I planted at the right moment, a few times in those same years, in a small test plot. The difference was visible. I have not forgotten it. He asked her what the difference looked like. She thought about how to describe it. The adequate corn looks like corn doing its job, she said. The corn that thrives looks like corn being more than it expected to be. It is hard to say precisely, but when you have seen it, you know the difference. She died in her late 80s, still farming the same land with the same patient attention to the season's character rather than the calendar's instructions. The village held her method in memory long after her. Not as a formula, the method could not be reduced to formula, but as an orientation. Wait for the warmth, plant in the thrive conditions, and the seed will do more than you asked of it. The young farmer, who had learned from her thought about her teaching many years after her death, when he had grown old himself and was asked by young people in his own village to explain what made some harvests extraordinary and others merely adequate. He found, in trying to explain it, that the hardest thing to convey was not the technical knowledge, the reading of the soil temperature, the selection of the seeds. The hardest thing was the disposition that made the technical knowledge usable, the genuine willingness to wait when the sign said wait, even when the calendar said plant, even when the neighbors were already planting, even when every habit of the farming life said, it is time. Waiting against all of that pressure required a particular quality of trust. Trust in the signs rather than the schedule. He had learned it from watching her. He tried to teach it by watching with his students, standing in the cold mornings with his hand pressed into the earth, saying nothing, waiting for the moment when the right temperature could be felt and not just calculated. Most of them learned it eventually. A few never did. These last were not bad farmers, they were adequate farmers. And the distance between adequate and extraordinary, he had found, was almost always this: the willingness to wait for what the season was actually offering. In Mayan cosmological understanding, the relationship between seed and time is one of the most sacred teachings, a recognition that every seed contains potential that is only accessible at specific moments. The Mayan calendar traditions, with their interlocking cycles of time, were not primarily instruments for scheduling. They were a description of the quality of different moments, which were suited to planting, which to harvest, which to rest, which to the particular kinds of action that required the alignment of human intention with the broader movements of the cosmos. The corn, maize, the heart of Mesoamerican life, held a particular place in this understanding. Corn was not simply food. It was, in Mayan creation mythology, the substance from which human beings were made. To grow corn well was to participate in the original act of creation, and to grow it well required exactly the farmer's sensitivity, reading the moment, planting in alignment with what the season was actually offering rather than what the farmer had decided in advance. The Mayan teaching is also clear about the relationship between the human and the seed. The human is the servant of the corn's potential, not its master. The corn knows what it needs to become. The farmer's knowledge and skill are in the service of the corn's own becoming. This is Wu Wei applied to agriculture. Action in service of the natural movement, rather than the natural movement bent to serve human intention. Lao Tzu praised the uncarved block. The Mayan tradition praised the unplanted seed, the potential before it becomes one specific thing. In the moment before planting, everything is still possible. In the thrive conditions, that possibility becomes something extraordinary. Think about the moments in your life when you did something in its right time. Not its convenient time, not its planned time, but the moment when the conditions were actually ready. Perhaps a conversation you had been postponing for months that found its moment naturally, and because it found its moment rather than being forced, resolved in a way that all your prior attempts had not. Perhaps a decision that waited until you had enough information, not perfect information, but enough, and landed in exactly the right place because you had resisted the pressure to decide before you were ready. Perhaps the beginning of something, a project, a relationship, a change that worked because you waited for the thrive conditions rather than the survive conditions. The adequate thing and the extraordinary thing are often separated by the width of a decision to wait, to be patient, not out of passivity, but out of respect for the seed's own knowledge of what it needs. This shows up in ordinary life in the particular cost of rushing what should not be rushed, the cake taken from the oven before it is done, the conversation pressed before the ground is warm, the work submitted before the thought is complete. Adequacy at the cost of whatever the thrive conditions would have produced. You may have felt this yourself in the specific regret of having acted too soon, not the regret of a wrong action, but the regret of a right action done in the wrong season, which produced something less than the right season would have yielded. Right now, in this moment, the seeds you are carrying can wait. Tomorrow has warmth enough for everything that needs planting. Tonight is the ground resting, the temperature building, the unhurried preparation of conditions. Rest in that. The season knows when you are ready. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu ended the Tao Te Ching with a benediction that summarizes everything he had been teaching. The sage does not contend, and therefore no one can contend with them. The sage acts without accumulating. The sage helps without expecting acknowledgement. The sage's success belongs not to the sage, but to the Tao that flows through them. This is the final and most demanding expression of the water teaching. Not just that softness overcomes hardness, though it does. Not just that yielding is not surrender, though it isn't. But that the fullest expression of the water quality is the life lived without accumulation, without the keeping of accounts, without the need for the world to confirm that you have been here and that you have done something worth noting. Water does not sign its work. The river does not put its name on the canyon it has carved. The rain does not wait for thanks. It simply falls and returns to the sea and falls again. For most of us, this level of the teaching is aspirational. We do keep accounts. We do need some acknowledgement. We are not sages. And Lao Tzu was not scolding those who are not sages. He was describing a direction, a quality of travel rather than a destination. The question is not, have I arrived? The question is, am I moving in this direction? And in this moment, in this breath, the answer is almost always yes. Because this moment, this breath, these ask nothing except our presence in them. And presence, offered without agenda, is the water quality available to everyone right now. There was once a bridge builder who was known for making things that lasted. She had built bridges across 3 rivers in her region, and all of them were still in use long after she had died, long after the method she had used was superseded by newer ones. Her bridges were studied by later builders, not because the techniques were still the best available, but because something in their structure continued to work in ways that interested people who thought carefully about how weight and force and time moved through material. What her contemporaries had not fully understood, and what later investigators pieced together from her notes and from the physical evidence of the structures themselves, was that her bridges were designed to move, not visibly. But the materials she chose, the way she assembled them, the particular proportions she used, all of it was calibrated to allow the structure to flex slightly under load and temperature change and to return. A bridge that cannot flex at all, she had written in one of her few surviving documents, is a bridge that is spending every moment of its existence fighting the forces acting on it. It will win this fight for a long time, and then it will lose it completely. She had learned this from studying old bridges that had failed, and from the few very old ones that had not. The failed ones were almost always the rigid ones, the most ambitious structures of their time, built to resist every force that might act on them. The ones that endured were usually the humbler ones, the ones that had some capacity for give. She had also learned something from water itself. She was a careful observer of how rivers moved, and she noticed that the most destructive floods were not, in the end, the ones that applied the most force. They were the ones that found the small vulnerability, the slight weakness in a foundation, the place where the bank was least resistant, and worked that weakness until the resistance was overcome. She built her bridges with this in mind. She tried to make them bridges that water had no argument with, structures that moved in some small way with the forces acting on them, so that there was no single point of rigidity for the water to work at. Late in her life, a young engineer came to study with her and asked her to describe her method. "I build with the forces rather than against them," she said. "What does that mean in practice?" he asked. "It means I spend more time studying what I am building into than what I am building," she said. "The river, the ground, the air over the water in different seasons. These are the conditions my structure will live in. If I understand them precisely, I can build something that responds to them rather than resisting them. If I only understand building, the materials, the techniques, the calculations, I will build something that resists until it can no longer resist." "And the water always wins in the end?" he asked. "The water is patient," she said. "It has no deadline. Whatever I build will outlast me. Whatever the water is working on will outlast my structure. I can only choose whether my structure contributes to the work of the water or fights it. Fighting it delays the outcome slightly. Contributing to it produces something that participates in what was already happening." He asked what she meant by contributing to the work of the water. "A bridge that moves slightly with the flood does not give the flood anything rigid to work against," she said. "The flood passes through, around, under. Nothing concentrates, nothing builds to the breaking point." She paused. "I cannot stop the flood, but I can build something that has nothing for the flood to break." In Norse tradition, the great sagas are full of figures who attempt to resist the forces of fate, weird, the inevitable current of events, and are broken by their resistance. And alongside these, there are figures who move with fate, who recognize the current and find within it their particular form of action, and who achieve something more than those who fought the current and were swept away. The Norse understanding of fate is not simple determinism. Weird is not a fixed script. It is more like a current, a set of forces and tendencies within which human choice and action operate. The wise person does not pretend the current is not there, nor do they give themselves over to it passively. They read the current and find the way to move through it that is neither fighting nor drowning. The craftsperson's tradition in Norse culture also carries this understanding. The great Norse smiths and woodworkers and builders were understood not as people who imposed their will on their materials, but as people who understood their materials so completely that they could work in alignment with the material's own nature. The ship that was carved with the grain of the wood rather than across it. The blade that was worked to the temperature the metal was ready for. The longhouse built to flex in the wind rather than standing rigid against it. This is Lao Tzu's teaching in the language of the North. The soft overcomes the hard, not by being harder, but by being more patient, more responsive, more willing to find the way that works with what is actually there. And the bridge builder's contribution, her structures that moved slightly, that offered the flood nothing to break, is the Norse smith's teaching made into stone and timber. Yielding is not surrender. It is the most sophisticated form of endurance. Think about something you have been carrying for a long time that might benefit from the quality of the bridge that moves. Not something you should abandon, something you have been holding with such rigidity that it has become the thing the flood works at, the point of resistance that concentrates the force rather than distributing it. We hold things rigidly because we love them, or because we are afraid of losing them, or because we have confused their form with their substance. The bridge builder understood that the substance of the bridge, its function, its crossing of the river, could only be preserved by being willing to let the form flex. The bridge that maintained its exact form through the flood was not more the bridge, it was the bridge that failed. This shows up in ordinary life in all the plans held too tightly. the vision so fixed that the project cannot respond to what the project actually becomes, the expectation so firm that the relationship cannot become what it actually is, the identity so defended that the person inside cannot grow past the form they were at 20. You may have felt this yourself in the particular relief of letting something flex, allowing a plan to become something different from what you intended, and finding that the something different was more useful than what you had imagined. Not the failure of the vision. The vision made more alive by contact with what was actually possible. Right now, in this moment, there is nothing you need to hold rigidly. The night requires flexibility of you only in the most ordinary sense, to allow yourself to be different in the morning from what you are now. The sleep will do that. You do not need to plan it. Simply move with it. The way the bridge moves with the flood, giving it nothing to work against, offering it the gap it needs, and standing whole in the morning. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with water. We began with Lao Tzu's oldest and most patient question: what is softer than water, and what is more powerful? And through 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many sides. We sat with a young man who spent 12 years making demands and 1 year writing small letters, and found that the small letters carved what the demands could not. We watched the rope maker's hands find the strength in many soft strands twisted together, and heard her say, "Soft things, wound in the right way, bear more than anyone expects." We sat beside a river with a stoic teacher who showed us iron rusting and stone wearing and said, "The soft does not defeat the hard by becoming harder. It simply keeps moving." We watched glass take shape not through the glassblower's force, but through the meeting of breath and material, the negotiation between two natures, producing a form that neither could have arrived at alone. We followed a diver into depths she had never reached, finding them not by fighting her way down, but by releasing the buoyancy that had been keeping her up. We soaked leather in a basin and learned that the most important step is the one that creates the conditions for all the other steps, that preparation is not delay, but the work itself. We listened to the silence of a woman whose words carried weight because she had waited long enough for her own mead to say them, to dissolve. We sat in the presence of a healer whose lightest touch reached where the forceful treatments had not. We learned from an old grandmother that the word which waits until it is genuinely needed is the word that lands without resistance. We watched a woman read the color of the sea, its depths, its shallows, its springs and currents, and heard her teacher say, "Maintain genuine uncertainty, even as the vocabulary grows." We watched a painter distribute her attention like rain, covering the whole surface equally, and found that the uninteresting areas were the foundation the interesting ones rested on. We planted corn in warm soil rather than cold, and waited for the thrive conditions rather than the survive ones. And we built a bridge designed to flex, offering the flood nothing rigid to work against. 13 chapters, 13 different materials, the same water moving through all of them. You are not the version of yourself that fights. Tonight you do not need to be. You are not the hard thing, the resistant thing, the thing that holds its form at all cost. You are the part of yourself that can move with what is here. The part that has known, in its better moments, that yielding is not weakness, that the open hand receives more than the closed fist ever could, and that the most enduring things are often the softest. This teaching is not mastered in a night. Lao Tzu offered it in 81 short verses and trusted that a lifetime of reading them would still be insufficient. The river doesn't finish with the stone. It keeps returning, season after season, and each season the stone is very slightly different. But tonight, in this particular returning, something has been deposited. Perhaps something small, perhaps the beginning of the question, where am I being harder than I need to be? Where might I yield and find not loss but access? Where is the gap in the wall I have been too busy with the gate to notice? You do not need to answer these questions now. The night is not the time for answers. The night is the time for the question to soak in the basin, to soften in the water, to release the locked fibers, to become ready for what the morning can shape it into. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready now to set down. The soft overcomes the hard, always. In time, you do not need to be the force tonight. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.